Sofia Coppola's 2006 production, Marie Antoinette, illustrates money, womanhood, and queendom through rich costuming. The dress is very much inspired by the 18th century, allowing a personal insight into the life of Marie Antoinette herself. Colours are kept rich, and detail is elaborated upon by camera angles which create a wealthy ambience. In a recent article by Jason Bailey for The Playlist, Coppola states that she was, quote, more interested in being impressionistic and in capturing what I thought Marie Antoinette was like, and hoped that I make it accurate enough that it could pass, but my focus was really the feeling, end quote. It comes as no surprise that Coppola encapsulates the essence of 18th century fashion in order to create a desired feeling of wealth, love, and what it is like to be a monarch during the latter half of the 18th century. This video essay will focus on how Coppola's choice of costume in her film Marie Antoinette reflects the period and the true queen herself. It will highlight elements of fashions in relation to class, gender, as a means of capturing the 18th century for its politics and philosophy. This video essay will contain visual comparisons of 18th century dress told through portraits, with Coppola's interpretation in order to establish materialism and identity within this period of time. First, we will discuss Coppola's costuming in relation to gender. During the 18th century, gender roles were hard to determine via dress, especially in the upper classes, due to the extravagant detail included in both menswear and womenswear. In particular, this scene provides us with a view of Coppola's costuming choices, with makeup and sheer detail being placed on both men and women, making them appear as a homogeneous group of aristocrats, defined by the status of their wealth rather than sex. However, when we assess the costuming worn by Kirsten Dunst, playing Antoinette, the gendered fashions of the 18th century are brought to life, as well as through Dunst's girlish and naive interpretation of the young soon-to-be queen. Coppola portrays Antoinette through the vision of a divine, feminine queen. A highly rococo approach is taken to illustrate the queen's frivolity and expenditure. For the true Antoinette, this sparked her downfall in the eyes of society as her expenditure and sexuality was used as a tool for the propaganda against her. This portrayal of wealth signifies the luxurious femininity experienced in Antoinette's queendom. Costuming elaborates upon her beauty and exemplifies her lack of queenly duties due to her time being consumed by fashion and expenditure. History tells us that Antoinette's two feminine sides consisted of the frivolous queen and the pastoral farm girl, both wrapped up in the luxuries of wealth. Meredith Martin's book, Dairy Queens, outlines the rich pastoral life that Antoinette desired. She suggested that Antoinette, quote, wasn't trying to conceal her identity at the amour, quote, that Louis gave her in 1774, but, quote, was instead attempting to express her royal status, or more precisely her queenship, in a novel way, unquote. This contrast in lives which were desired by the Queen are represented through the costuming in Coppola's film. The scenes filmed at the Petit Trianon illustrates the pastoral life taken up by Antoinette through farming, drinking milk, picking strawberries and frolicking around amongst the meadows. These pastoral scenes also portray Antoinette as a mother, alluding to a woman's natural and desired role. The costuming used in particular during these scenes exemplifies the pastoral and naturalistic life lived at the Petit Trianon. The dress worn here is what was referred to as the robe en chemise, a muslin dress usually associated with undergarments, worn over a bodice and tied at the waist with a detailed sash. This dress resembles the one worn by Antoinette in her 1783 portrait by Elizabeth Louis Vigée Lebrun. The portrait features Marie Antoinette in a robe en chemise holding a rose. The painting sparked controversy as it illustrated the pastoral side of the Queen rather than the royal and was ordered to be taken down. In relation to gender, the difference between the pastoral and the royal sides of the Queen represent the struggles of freedom against queendom. Marie Antoinette's life at the Petit Trianon represents her freedom to live her desired feminine lifestyle with her daughter. Meanwhile, her courtly expenditure is what causes her downfall and thus presents little freedom at all. In her Vindication of the Rights of Women, Mary Wollstonecraft suggests that a person's faults are the, quote, the natural consequence of their education in society, end quote. She continues, it is reasonable to suppose that they will change their character and correct their vices and follies when they are allowed to be free in a physical and moral and civil sense, end quote. From what Wollstonecraft suggests, the physical, moral and civil freedom is applicable to the Petit Trianon scenes in Coppola's film, and therefore suggests that Marie Antoinette was corrected of her faults caused by her social stature as queen. The differentiation in costuming shows that as a female monarch, Marie Antoinette's experience is divided by the naturalistic roles of motherhood and the materialistic expectations as a queen. The divide in pastoral and royal portrayals of Marie Antoinette and her dress sense in Coppola's film illustrates that the true happiness of the Queen lies at the Petit Trianon. As previously discussed in relation to Wollstonecraft, Marie Antoinette's life at the Petit Trianon allows distance between her life at court and the scrutiny that she is under. Despite the shopping scene connoting joy and pleasure in fashion, the character of Marie Antoinette is much more free in herself when she is at the Petit Trianon, reflected in the white robe en chemise style clothing and the lack of makeup and volumized hair. She is in control of her own hamlet, welcoming her friends to her little village, as she says in the film, whereas when she is at court, the materialistic way of living and the pleasures it brings are short-lived. On top of this, many of the saddest scenes of child loss, pressure to conceive, and leaving behind her home take place when she is wearing the overly exaggerated and detailed pieces of clothing. Ulrich Lehmann's book Fashion and Materialism describes the face of fashion within capitalism. He states, fashion is both material covering and materialistic representation of the body/subject beneath it, which defines itself through the consumption of particular clothes at certain points in time. This is somewhat credible in its outline of how fashion is a representation of the person who sports it. However, when looking at Marie Antoinette and Coppola's costume choices, the clothing worn at court only represents the Queen as a materialistic person, and therefore her fashions are used to demonstrate her spending habits, which are used against her, labelling her as Madame Deficit. Yet, this is only the outer shell of the Queen, and the fashions hide how she truly feels, and that is trapped. Her true self is allowed to be free when she is at the Petit Trianon, and her simplistic clothing is a result of this. Furthermore, to demonstrate the court clothing is not being a true representation of the Queen, the scene when she supposedly states, "Let them eat cake," takes place in the intimate place of her bathtub, where she is wearing nothing. This insinuates how, without her clothing, she is still the materialistic and selfish queen which the propaganda paints her to be. However, the audience is quickly reminded that this is not true, and therefore portrays the Queen as one who is not defined by her materialistic dress sense at court, but the free fashions at the Petit Trianon. Examples of the materialistic phrases used against the Queen are demonstrated during this scene of the painting. Coppola's choice in clothing closely resembles the painting which replaced the robe en chemise painting previously discussed. This therefore portrays the Queen's bad reputation to stem from her clothing choices, and this doesn't represent her. The original, more pastoral painting conveys the Queen's true self, and this painting illustrates the Queen who falls victim to her materialism. This describes the tensions experienced by the upper classes during the latter half of the 18th century and illustrates the likes of them and the Queen as being just human. Overall, Coppola's choice in costume is a response to gender and class dynamics faced by Marie Antoinette. The two queens are represented amongst the lavish lifestyle and clothing at court and the pastoral, natural fashions at the Petit Trianon. From the two, the lifestyle which evidently contains more happiness for the Queen is the life lived at the Petit Trianon. This is due to her being away from the confines of court and the lifestyle choices that causes her downfall in the eyes of society. The 18th century presented many historical moments of fashion, including the widening panniers, the extensions in the wigs, and also the increasingly feminine menswear. When we assess the representation of the century's fashion moments throughout Coppola's film, they maintain the highly beautiful yet gaudy Rococo features of the period and bring them to life through camera angles and character development. Towards the end of the film, the black mourning clothes at court contrast the white clothes of freedom she wears at the Petit Trianon, illustrating the Queen's own revolution in her self-discovery. However, the Petit Trianon is short-lived, and the court scenes resume with copious amounts of loss and increasing tensions of the French Revolution. As for the Queen, her iconic state of fashion choices and rebellions are made clear in Coppola's film, highlighting the dramatic turns of the century. After all, fashion is not an island, it's a response, and Coppola responds to the century with an almighty contrast in grandeur and the natural world through costume. These two contrasting lives demonstrated through costume show the dynamic period which Marie Antoinette lived in for both a woman and a monarch.